All right, everybody, we have moved on to Roots week number 9. And just to start off this week, I do want to draw attention to the question and answer this week. Then you can find these over on the website. But if you look at week 9, it asks, what is a covenant? I want to draw attention to that because the word covenant, you've probably heard at church before. It is a churchy word that we use, and we use that word because it appears in the Bible, but it's not easy to define necessarily. I don't think a lot of people necessarily really know what they're talking about when they use it, because you wouldn't use the word covenant really anywhere outside of church. It's not like a word that we use in everyday English language. It's just, it's a Bible word. But it's an incredibly important one to the whole storyline of the scripture. And so it really does play a huge role in what we believe. And it just has a ton of impact. And so it's worth defining, what we're talking about. So we've been talking about Israel, God calling Abraham. They wind up in Egypt. God brings them out of slavery in Egypt. After he brings them out, he establishes a covenant with his people. So what is a covenant is an important question to answer. Now, I would encourage you to go onto YouTube and look up Bible Project Covenant. They have a wonderful video that explains what a covenant is in just a few minutes. It's really very helpful, but the answer that I've given is just a covenant is a special relationship between God and people. God promises to care for his people, and his people promise to obey him. That's just kind of where I'm going to leave it for now. I'd encourage you to look up that video and just to read along with these scriptures so you can kind of see for yourself how this works out. So the very first passage that we're going to read is God's covenant with Israel after they've been brought out of slavery. There's been covenants before this. God made a covenant with Noah. God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he reiterates that to Isaac and Jacob as well. But this is the covenant that he initiates with the nation as a whole. With the people of Israel. And this happens in Exodus 24. So you want to read that whole chapter. I'm just going to pick out a few verses and sort of explain what's going on. So it says in 24 verses 1 and 2, it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance, but Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The others must not come near, and the people may not come up with him. Now, I want to start with that because that just sort of establishes sort of a key problem that's going to be addressed over the next few books. So if you look at Genesis, you have the story of how the people wind up in Egypt. Exodus, the first half is about how the people get out of Egypt. But then the last half of Exodus is a bunch of basically, it has some stories, but it's basically a bunch of rules and commandments. Leviticus is almost entirely rules and commandments. Numbers, tons of rules and commandments mixed in with some stories. Deuteronomy, rules and commandments. It's the law. That's why we call it that. And understanding this passage will help you sort of unlock what the rest of that stuff is all about. Because what you'll notice is that only Moses can go up into God's presence. And even when he does, he has to be careful. The rest can't really approach God and get too close, which is the problem that these books are trying to address. How can a holy God live with sinful people? Sinful people can't enter into his presence and live. And so what is God going to do about that? How are they going to get along? How are these people going to live with and represent God to the rest of the nations when they are themselves sinful and broken and flawed in so many ways? Well, that's what the covenant is for. The covenant explains sort of the terms of the relationship, what God expects out of his people, how God is going to reach towards them, how he's going to take care of them, how he's going to bless them in all these ways, and how they should live in light of that blessing, how they live in light of the salvation that God has given to them. So you go further down and it talks about how God initiates the covenant, how eventually Moses and these elders get to go and be in God's presence, because that's what God is trying to do. God is trying to bring people, not just the Israelites, but the whole nations, into his presence. But seeing that he is holy and you and I, we're sinful, we have to be careful how we do that. God is not something that we can approach or talk about casually. God is a very serious thing. We can't just be all willy-nilly about him and act as if everything's okay, he's just our buddy or this kind of thing. No, God is holy. God is powerful. If sinners go directly into the presence of God, they die. That's what happens in the Bible. And so for us to be with God, an incredible thing has to happen. And that's what Jesus is all about, because as we're going to get through this, God gives them ways to sort of enter into his presence from a distance, very carefully. You can only get so close and this kind of thing. And there's these rules and all this sort of stuff. But in Hebrews, it says that we can approach the throne of God boldly because of what Jesus did for us. And so that's a wonderful blessing for us. But we have to honor Christ. We have to love Christ and put our faith in him. And by doing that, we gain access to be with God and enter into a covenant with him.